In the summer of 1947, fire swept through Bar Harbor in Maine. Mansions that had stood for generations burned. Families who'd summered there for decades watched their estates disappear. By morning, a significant piece of Gilded Age wealth had vanished. That fire erased part of American fortune's landscape, but it wasn't alone in making these palaces disappear. From Massachusetts to Florida, the East Coast was once lined with Gilded Age estates that rivaled anything in Newport or on Fifth Avenue. Houses built by Rockefellers, Roosevelts, and railroad barons. Winter retreats where the wealthiest families in America gathered, summer colonies more exclusive than any club in New York. Most are gone now. Demolished, burned, or so thoroughly forgotten that even historians struggle to remember them. This is the story of those lost palaces, the ones that didn't make it into the guidebooks, the ones that defined American power just as completely as the Breakers or Marble House, but left almost nothing behind except fading photographs and property records. If you enjoy these deep dives into Gilded Age power and architecture, please hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps me continue researching and creating these stories. If you have other insights, please share them in the comments. 12 states, 12 forgotten empires. Let's begin where American old money started. Boston's vanished Commonwealth Avenue palaces. Boston's Beacon Hill and Back Bay still whisper old money, but the grandest Gilded Age mansions, the ones that actually dominated the city, are gone. Commonwealth Avenue in the 1890s was lined with palaces that made visiting New Yorkers take notice. Limestone facades stretched for blocks. Ballrooms held elaborate entertainments. Art collections filled private galleries. This was where industrial fortunes tried to translate into Boston acceptance. The Avenue attracted families looking to establish themselves in Boston society. The Vanderbilt family had connections to the area. Relations of the famous Newport branch reportedly maintained presence in Boston's most fashionable neighborhoods during this period. The goal was always the same: translate industrial wealth into social acceptance among Boston's old guard families. But Boston society operated differently than New York's. The old Brahmin families, names like Lowell and Cabot, who'd been wealthy since colonial times, tolerated new industrial money, but rarely fully embraced it. Commonwealth Avenue became an expensive testing ground where fortunes tried to purchase position that genealogy alone traditionally provided. Isabella Stewart Gardner became one of the Avenue's most fascinating residents before she built her famous museum. Her mansion hosted artists, intellectuals, and European nobility in combinations that scandalized proper Boston. The dinner parties mixed bohemians with Brahmins, creating social chaos that thrilled Gardner and horrified her more conservative neighbors. The Sears family, whose retail fortune was growing rapidly, built substantial homes in the area. The Ames family, with railroad and manufacturing wealth, occupied prominent positions. Each mansion required large staffs. Each represented a family attempting to purchase social position through architectural grandeur. By the early 1900s, the pattern was becoming clear. These weren't simply homes. They were expensive bets on acceptance that often failed to pay off in the way their builders hoped. The mansions started disappearing in the 1940s. World War II made grand houses nearly impossible to staff and maintain. Families donated art collections and sold properties. Developers bought estates for fractions of their construction costs, demolished them, and built apartments. Most of Commonwealth Avenue's Gilded Age palaces followed this pattern. Some became institutional property. A few facades survived because universities or organizations purchased them. But the concentrated wealth, the entire avenue of private palaces competing for attention, that vanished. Today, walking Commonwealth Avenue, you see fragments. Preserved doorways, occasional grand entrances that survived when the houses behind them didn't. But the scale is gone. The sense of an entire street dedicated to industrial fortunes trying to buy their way into old money acceptance exists only in archival photographs. Boston's Gilded Age wasn't gradually forgotten. It was systematically erased, replaced by a city that preferred remembering its colonial history over the uncomfortable decades when industrial fortunes tried buying their way into Brahmin circles. What remains are photographs in library archives, images of a street that once competed with Fifth Avenue, now reduced to decorative details on apartment buildings. The forgotten chapter of Boston's Gilded Age, demolished and built over, remembered mainly by architectural historians studying old property records. Commonwealth Avenue once represented the height of Boston ambition. Today, most people walking it have no idea the scale of what once stood there. The Rockefellers' Connecticut Refuge. Greenwich, Connecticut today means hedge fund billions and contemporary mega mansions. But in the late 1800s, it meant something entirely different. It was where America's wealthiest family went when they wanted to disappear. John D. Rockefeller Sr. didn't want Newport. Too public, too competitive, too many photographers waiting outside mansion gates. He wanted privacy. Land where his family could exist without constant observation. A place where wealth didn't have to perform for society's entertainment. He found possibilities in Connecticut's coastal areas. The details of specific properties and exact locations blur in historical records, which is precisely what the Rockefellers preferred. They weren't building showplaces meant to be photographed and discussed. They were creating private retreats designed to remain unknown. The Rockefeller approach to Connecticut real estate involved purchasing land, building modestly by Gilded Age standards, then expanding gradually. Dense landscaping, gated drives, houses set back from roads, everything calculated to provide isolation rather than display. Other wealthy families noticed and followed the example. Parts of Connecticut became sanctuaries for fortunes that wanted privacy over prestige. Estates were built to remain invisible. The architectural style mattered less than the isolation it provided. Success meant nobody discussed your property. Achievement meant maintaining absolute privacy despite extraordinary wealth. This created a fundamentally different Gilded Age landscape than Newport. Where Newport's mansions competed visually, Connecticut's estates competed to remain unseen. The families summering there preferred it that way. No guidebooks listed the properties, no society columns detailed the gatherings. The wealthy came and went without fanfare. The strategy worked for decades. These Connecticut retreats remained relatively unknown compared to Newport or Bar Harbor. But privacy couldn't protect the estates forever. The automobile changed everything. What had been distant retreats became commutable from New York City. Land values shifted. The logic of maintaining enormous private estates near an increasingly accessible city began breaking down. Many of the original Rockefeller properties were eventually donated, sold, or absorbed into other uses. Some became parks, others were subdivided. The exact details are often unclear because the families succeeded so completely at avoiding public attention during the estate's private years. Today, Greenwich and surrounding areas have remnants of this Gilded Age character, but they're harder to identify than Newport's obvious palaces. The estates that remain are often so modified or subdivided that tracing their origins requires significant research. The families who built them succeeded too well at remaining private. That success meant their homes left few historical traces. The Rockefeller approach to Gilded Age wealth, seeking retreat over display, created estates that almost nobody remembers. These Connecticut properties became the anti-Newport. Where one location defined itself through architectural competition and social display, the other defined itself through deliberate obscurity. Both strategies ultimately failed to preserve their worlds intact. Newport's mansions became museums, their private purposes extinct. Connecticut's estates disappeared into subdivision and redevelopment, their privacy breached by suburban expansion. What these Connecticut retreats represented, the possibility of maintaining enormous wealth in complete seclusion, proved as temporary as Newport's vision of eternal social dominance. Different approaches led to the same conclusion. The Gilded Age couldn't sustain itself regardless of strategy. The estates vanished not because they were demolished dramatically, but because nobody outside the families involved knew they were there in the first place. Privacy in the Gilded Age meant obscurity in history. The houses disappeared quietly, leaving almost no trace except occasional references in property records and family papers. Seal Harbor, the Rockefeller colony that survived. Bar Harbor gets the attention. The fire, the lost mansions, the dramatic story of Gilded Age wealth destroyed. But 10 miles south, in Seal Harbor, something different happened. The Rockefellers built there too. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who inherited Standard Oil's fortune and spent decades managing it, chose Seal Harbor deliberately. He wanted what his father had sought in Connecticut: privacy, control, distance from society's expectations. The main estate in Seal Harbor was called the Eyrie. It sat on Mount Desert Island overlooking the harbor and the Atlantic beyond. Rockefeller purchased land there in the early 1900s and spent decades developing it into exactly what he wanted. The main house was substantial but not ostentatious by Gilded Age standards. Gardens required constant maintenance, and miles of carriage roads, built to Rockefeller's exact specifications, wound through carefully managed wilderness. This wasn't a summer cottage in the Bar Harbor sense. Bar Harbor's estates competed for attention, hosted elaborate parties, defined themselves through social performance. The Eyrie defined itself through absence of competition. Rockefeller built what he wanted without worrying about what neighbors might think, primarily because he'd ensured he had very few neighbors. Seal Harbor became increasingly a Rockefeller family compound. Other family members built nearby. The family controlled enough land to create their own private world. The isolation was intentional and carefully maintained. While Bar Harbor filled with society families throwing parties and racing yachts, Seal Harbor remained quiet, controlled, essentially closed to outsiders. Rockefeller's carriage roads became a particular obsession. He invested heavily in building and maintaining them, creating a network that allowed him to ride through the island's forests and along its coastline without encountering automobiles or crowds. The roads were built to last, constructed with careful engineering and attention to detail. The roads revealed something about Gilded Age wealth at its peak. Rockefeller had resources to reshape an entire landscape for personal pleasure. The carriage roads served no public purpose initially. They existed because one man wanted to ride horses and carriages through beautiful terrain without interruption. When the Bar Harbor fire swept through Mount Desert Island in 1947, it came near Seal Harbor, but the Rockefeller properties largely survived. The stone carriage roads and careful land management may have helped protect the area. While Bar Harbor's more concentrated, more social Gilded Age world burned, Seal Harbor's intensely private Rockefeller world remained largely intact. The survival created an interesting contrast. Bar Harbor's public-facing estates vanished. Seal Harbor's deliberately private world survived, protected by the same isolation that had defined it from the beginning. Rockefeller Jr. eventually donated much of his Mount Desert Island property to help create Acadia National Park. The carriage roads, built for private pleasure, became public amenities. The Eyrie itself was eventually demolished, but the landscape he'd shaped remained, transformed from private retreat into public treasure. Seal Harbor today represents one of the Gilded Age's most successful disappearing acts. The wealth was extraordinary, the impact on the landscape was permanent. But the private world Rockefeller created vanished so completely that tourists driving through Acadia often have no idea they're experiencing one man's personal vision, donated to public use only after his death. The carriage roads remain Rockefeller's most visible legacy in the area. Miles of carefully engineered paths, stone bridges, and scenic overlooks, all originally built so one family could ride horses in peace. Today they're popular hiking and biking trails, used by thousands who may not realize they're walking through the remains of America's most private Gilded Age retreat. What Seal Harbor proved was that Gilded Age wealth could sometimes survive if it avoided competition and display. Bar Harbor's clustered estates burned together. Seal Harbor's isolated properties survived because they'd separated themselves, creating private worlds that didn't depend on validation from society or rivals. But survival didn't mean preservation of the original purpose. The Eyrie is gone. Most of Seal Harbor's other Gilded Age structures have been modified significantly or demolished. What remains is infrastructure, carriage roads and stone bridges, the bones of a private empire that outlasted the houses it was built to serve. Hyde Park and the Roosevelt Legacy. The Hudson Valley was America's first old money landscape. Long before Newport or Palm Beach, wealthy New Yorkers built estates along the river north of the city. By the Gilded Age, those estates had been standing for generations, occupied by families who considered themselves something close to American aristocracy. The Roosevelts were among them. Franklin Roosevelt's family had been Hudson Valley landowners since colonial times. The Roosevelt estate at Hyde Park, known as Springwood, represented something different from the nouveau riche palaces being built elsewhere during the Gilded Age. This was inherited property, old money trying to maintain position, while industrial fortunes reshaped what wealth meant in America. Springwood started as a relatively modest house purchased in the mid-1800s. Franklin's father expanded it over time, but carefully, without the aggressive grandeur characterizing Gilded Age excess elsewhere. The result was substantial but restrained compared to nearby Vanderbilt properties, a house that suggested old money rather than announced new fortune. Franklin Roosevelt grew up in that world. Hyde Park society operated on assumptions that Gilded Age industrialists sometimes found baffling. Lineage mattered enormously. Restraint was valued over display. The families who'd been there for generations intended to remain. Money was necessary, but discussing it directly was considered somewhat vulgar. This created tension during the Gilded Age's peak years. The Vanderbilts built massive estates in the Hudson Valley. Industrial fortunes constructed palaces that dwarfed the old family homes. The new wealth was louder, more visible, unapologetically grand. It made the old money estates look almost modest by comparison. The Roosevelts navigated this carefully. They expanded Springwood incrementally, maintaining an appearance of restraint even as the house grew substantially. They hosted gatherings but called them something other than parties. They employed staffs but kept them smaller than the Vanderbilt or Astor properties nearby. Every choice was calculated to suggest that their wealth was older, more legitimate, more refined than the industrial fortunes building, showplaces up and down the valley. Franklin Roosevelt's political career gave Springwood additional meaning. As he moved toward the presidency, the house became less purely private retreat and more public symbol. The property represented a certain vision of American leadership, the idea that the country had families of natural governing ability who served not from ambition, but from inherited sense of responsibility. After Roosevelt's death, Eleanor donated Springwood to the federal government. It became a national historic site, preserved largely as the family had left it. This was unusual. Most Gilded Age estates were demolished or drastically modified. Springwood was frozen in time, protected by Roosevelt's historical importance. Today, visiting Springwood feels like stepping into a particular vision of what old money wanted to project during the Gilded Age. The house is comfortable but not overwhelming, impressive but not intimidating, wealthy but not ostentatiously so. It's exactly the image old Hudson Valley families wanted to maintain, preserved long after that world fundamentally changed. The Hudson Valley contains numerous similar estates, properties owned by families with colonial-era roots, expanded during the Gilded Age, but always with attention toward appearing more modest than the new industrial palaces. Many are now museums or institutions. Some remain in family hands. Almost all are significantly modified from their Gilded Age form. What the Hudson Valley represented during the Gilded Age was tension between old and new money. The industrial fortunes were often larger, but the old families had social legitimacy. The competition played out in architecture and social behavior, each side trying to prove their version of wealth was superior. In some ways, the old money lost. The industrial fortunes were simply too large to compete with through restraint and pedigree alone. But the old families outlasted many of the industrial ones in a different way. Their estates, because they were more modest, often adapted better to changing economics. Houses like Springwood could be maintained when larger Vanderbilt palaces became impossibly expensive. The result is a Hudson Valley landscape where old money estates are sometimes better preserved than the Gilded Age showplaces that once overshadowed them. The strategy of calculated modesty, which seemed almost offensive during the Gilded Age's peak, proved more sustainable long-term. Springwood stands today as monument to a specific approach to American wealth, not the largest or most impressive, but among the most enduring. Old money that survived partly by refusing to compete on the terms the Gilded Age established. Lynwood Hall, Monument to Tragedy. Philadelphia's main line wasn't named for train tracks alone, it was named for power. The Pennsylvania Railroad's main line ran west from Philadelphia through what became some of the wealthiest suburbs in America. The families who lived there often had deep connections to the railroad, the city, and much of the nation's industrial economy. The Widener family was prominent among them. Peter A.B. Widener built his fortune initially in streetcars, then expanded into transit systems and utilities. By 1900, he had become one of America's wealthiest men and apparently felt he needed a house that reflected that status. He built Lynwood Hall in Elkins Park, near the main line, beginning construction in the late 1890s. The architect was Horace Trumbauer, who would later design the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The house, when completed, ranked among the largest private residences in America. The exact room count varies in different sources, but it was substantial by any measure. There was a ballroom that could host large gatherings, an art gallery designed specifically to hold what became one of the finest private collections in the country. Widener filled that gallery with masterpieces, works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Raphael. He purchased significant pieces, competed with museums, acquired works that belonged in the world's greatest institutions. The art collection at Lynwood Hall became well known among scholars and serious collectors. The house itself was designed in French neoclassical style, limestone exterior, formal proportions, meant to suggest European palace tradition while asserting American industrial wealth. The scale was extraordinary by any standard. Everything about Lynwood Hall announced substantial achievement. But the house is remembered today primarily for tragedy. In April 1912, Peter Widener's son, George, and grandson, Harry, booked passage on a ship returning from Europe. They'd been abroad, and the family art collection was growing. The ship was Titanic. Both George and Harry Widener died in the sinking. Peter Widener, who'd built a commercial empire and filled a palace with treasures, couldn't save his son or grandson. The loss devastated the family. Lynwood Hall, built to celebrate success, became associated with grief. Widener continued collecting afterward, but something had changed. He began discussing what would happen to the collection long term. When he died in 1915, his will included provisions for the art. Much of it eventually went to the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Lynwood Hall's treasures would become available to the public. The house itself faced an uncertain future without its original purpose. Widener's heirs maintained it for a period, but the scale made it extremely difficult to use as a normal private residence. The art collection was gone. The family that had filled the house was diminished. By mid-century, Lynwood Hall had been sold. It changed hands multiple times over the following decades. It served as a school briefly. It sat vacant for extended periods. The neighborhood around it changed significantly. The main line's Gilded Age character faded. Lynwood Hall became something of an anomaly, too large to maintain easily, too expensive to demolish, too historically significant to simply ignore. Today, Lynwood Hall still stands but in deteriorating condition. The house has suffered from years of deferred maintenance. Preservation groups have attempted to save it, but the costs involved are staggering. The house that once held some of America's greatest art treasures has become a symbol of how even the most substantial Gilded Age palaces struggle to survive without ongoing purpose and substantial resources. The Widener story captures something about the Gilded Age's fundamental fragility. The wealth was real. The collections were extraordinary. The houses were built to impressive standards. But all of it depended on continued fortune and family commitment. When either disappeared, even palaces as substantial as Lynwood Hall could become liabilities rather than legacies. Philadelphia's main line still exists as a wealthy area, but the Gilded Age estates that once defined it are mostly gone or significantly transformed. Lynwood Hall's slow deterioration is just the most visible example of a broader pattern. The palaces often couldn't adapt to new economic realities. The families couldn't always maintain them across generations. The mathematics changed too drastically. What remains of Widener's cultural vision is largely the art collection he helped assemble. Those masterpieces hang in museums, seen by many visitors, properly preserved. The house he built to hold them struggles for survival, visited mainly by people interested in preservation or architectural history. Lynwood Hall represents a particular Gilded Age assumption about permanence. Build something substantial enough and it must survive. Fill it with treasures valuable enough and they must be protected. Create wealth significant enough and it must continue. Widener made those assumptions, and the house stands as complicated evidence of both their partial truth and ultimate limitations. The Jersey Shore's forgotten presidential summers. The Jersey Shore today means summer tourism and beach towns, but in the late 1800s, a stretch of coast from Long Branch southward meant something entirely different. It meant presidential retreats and substantial summer estates, places where wealthy families escaped summer heat in the decades before air conditioning made cities bearable year-round. Multiple presidents spent summers in Long Branch. The list reportedly included Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Harrison, and others. The town became informally known at times as something like a summer capital. Where the president went, influence followed. Wealthy families built estates nearby. The shoreline developed with substantial homes. Deal, just south of Long Branch, became particularly fashionable among certain circles. Families with significant fortunes built there. The Guggenheim name appears in historical records of the area. So does Whitney. Industrial wealth translated into oceanfront property, houses built to catch sea breezes and provide comfortable summer living. These weren't year-round residences for most families. They were seasonal places, used for some months annually, staffed during summer, opened around June, and closed in September. But the investment was still substantial. The houses were properly designed and built, fitted with whatever modern amenities were available. They were meant to last and to serve their purpose well. The social life centered partly on the beach and partly on private clubs. Families would spend time by the water, afternoons at leisure, evenings at dinners and gatherings. There was an informality to summer life, but social structures and hierarchies still operated underneath the relaxed surface. The automobile changed the equation significantly. Once cars made the Jersey Shore increasingly accessible to middle-class vacationers, the exclusivity began collapsing. Beaches that had been relatively private became more public. Towns that had catered to presidential visits and wealthy summer residents began adapting to broader tourism. Many of the families who'd built substantial estates there began looking for summer places elsewhere. By the 1920s, the Jersey Shore's Gilded Age character was already shifting. Some estates were sold, others converted to different uses. A few remained in family hands but felt increasingly out of place as the shore democratized. The presidential connection faded. The social prestige diminished. What had been an exclusive summer colony became increasingly just another beach area. Most of the original Gilded Age estates are gone now, demolished and replaced with newer construction over the decades. The few that might survive are often so modified that identifying their original form requires research. The Jersey Shore's Gilded Age has left relatively little physical trace. What remains exists primarily in old photographs and historical records, images of a world that existed briefly and vanished fairly completely. The Jersey Shore story illustrates how quickly Gilded Age exclusivity could collapse when circumstances changed. The families who built there apparently assumed their wealth would continue guaranteeing privacy and social position. They likely didn't fully anticipate how technology and changing economics would make their retreats accessible to much broader populations. They built for a world where distance and expense created natural social barriers. When those barriers fell, the estates lost much of their original purpose. The transformation from exclusive retreat to mass tourism destination happened relatively quickly in historical terms. Within a couple of generations, the landscape shifted fundamentally. The wealthy families didn't fight the change extensively. They largely moved on, finding new exclusive locations farther from cities and crowds. What the Jersey Shore's story illustrates is how contingent Gilded Age social geography could be. A location might be extraordinarily fashionable one decade and much less so the next. The estates built during fashionable periods, regardless of how substantial, struggled to maintain meaning once the social context disappeared. Today, walking through areas like Deal, you see very little of the Gilded Age period. Perhaps an occasional older property, usually significantly modified. Street names that might hint at former character. But the physical world has been largely replaced by development that has no direct connection to what preceded it. The Jersey Shore's forgotten Gilded Age estates disappeared not through dramatic destruction, but through gradual irrelevance. When the social world that created them shifted, the houses lacked alternate obvious purposes. They were demolished or transformed because maintaining them without their original social meaning became difficult to justify. Evergreen, Baltimore's railroad fortune. Baltimore in the Gilded Age was deeply connected to railroads. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, one of America's first major lines, generated fortunes that shaped the city across generations. The Garrett family's involvement with the B&O gave them substantial influence in Baltimore for much of the 19th century. John Work Garrett managed the railroad during the Civil War, navigating complex strategic and political situations. He emerged with enhanced reputation and considerable wealth. His son, Robert Garrett, inherited both and expanded them into a fortune comparable to significant New York or Philadelphia wealth. The Garrett Mansion in Baltimore, known as Evergreen, began as a house purchased in the 1870s. Robert Garrett expanded it over time, adding wings, building a theater, creating a library for rare books and manuscripts. The house grew to accommodate an expanding art collection and the family's social role. Evergreen became an important center of Baltimore society. The Garretts hosted dinners, cultural events, gatherings that combined social and business purposes. The house was filled with art and furnishings that reflected the family's cultural interests and financial position. But Evergreen also had functional aspects. Robert Garrett apparently used the house partly for railroad business, hosting meetings with investors and other executives. The library served as working space as well as showpiece. The mansion had both social and practical dimensions. The Garretts represented Baltimore's particular approach to Gilded Age success. Perhaps less purely focused on social display than some New York families, with strong interest in cultural and institutional development. Robert Garrett supported Johns Hopkins University significantly. He contributed to arts institutions. He apparently saw wealth as something that should be used to shape Baltimore's cultural infrastructure. This approach meant Evergreen functioned as more than just a private house. The art collection served broader cultural purposes. The library was used by scholars. The mansion had aspects of a cultural institution alongside its role as family residence. When Robert Garrett died in 1905, his children inherited both the fortune and apparently some of his sense of cultural responsibility. They maintained Evergreen and continued building the collections. The house remained important to Baltimore's cultural life beyond just the family's immediate social circle. This longevity was somewhat unusual for Gilded Age estates. Many didn't survive their original builders by more than a generation or two. Evergreen lasted longer, partly because it had evolved into something approaching a cultural institution. The Garretts had successfully merged private wealth with broader public cultural purpose. In the early 1940s, the last family member to occupy Evergreen donated the house and its collections to Johns Hopkins University. The mansion became a museum and research facility. The collections remained largely intact. The library continued serving scholars. The building found institutional purpose while maintaining connection to its original function. Today, Evergreen operates as a museum, among the better-preserved Gilded Age estates. Not because it was necessarily the grandest or most expensive originally, but because the family built it with purposes that extended beyond private display. The Garretts apparently understood that wealth serving only immediate family pleasure often disappears. Wealth that builds or supports institutions can potentially survive much longer. Most of Baltimore's other significant railroad mansions have vanished or been converted to completely different uses. Evergreen survived partly because it was designed from relatively early on to be more than just one family's home. The Garrett approach to wealth, with its focus on cultural legacy alongside social position, proved more sustainable than pure display. Walking through Evergreen feels different than visiting some other preserved Gilded Age estates. The house doesn't overwhelm primarily through scale. It impresses more through substance, through collections built thoughtfully over time, through architecture serving clear purposes beyond just announcing wealth. The Garrett Mansion represents what the Gilded Age might have produced more often if families had approached wealth with similar sense of broader responsibility. Evergreen wasn't forgotten because it was never allowed to become purely private and therefore irrelevant when the family's direct involvement ended. Winterthur, the DuPont collection. Delaware means DuPont. The family's chemical fortune shaped the state so thoroughly that even today, Delaware's landscape shows constant DuPont influence. Winterthur represents that influence in a particular form. The estate has origins in the early 1800s, but it was Henry Francis DuPont, inheriting in the late 1920s, who transformed Winterthur into something remarkable. He substantially modified the house, but not to create a typical Gilded Age showplace. Henry Francis wanted space for collections, specifically American decorative arts he'd been acquiring. The house he developed was very large, well over 100 rooms, but the design was driven more by function than pure display. Rooms became period settings, showcasing furniture and objects from specific eras of American history. This approach revealed something about DuPont wealth by the 20th century. The family's position was thoroughly secure. What Henry Francis apparently wanted was cultural significance, a collection and setting that would establish him as a serious figure in American decorative arts rather than just another wealthy heir. Winterthur became his life's work. He spent decades acquiring objects, arranging rooms, refining everything. The estate's gardens received similar intense attention. The property encompassed very substantial acreage designed in naturalistic style. Nothing was casual. Every aspect was carefully considered. The attention extended to how the estate functioned. Winterthur wasn't just Henry Francis's home. It operated partly as a research institution even while he lived there. Scholars visited to study the collections. The house functioned as both private residence and cultural resource. This dual nature defined Winterthur from relatively early on. Henry Francis apparently built it to outlast him. When he formally donated the estate to become a museum in the early 1950s, the transition was relatively smooth. The house had already been operating with some institutional aspects. The formal change made permanent what had been developing. Today, Winterthur ranks among America's premier decorative arts museums. The collections are extensive and significant. The period rooms are carefully maintained. Scholars use the research library. The gardens attract visitors throughout the year. Much of what Henry Francis apparently envisioned has been realized. But Winterthur also represents what made DuPont wealth different from many Gilded Age fortunes. The family's chemical business was stable and multi-generational. The DuPont's wealth was never really in question. This security perhaps allowed different ambitions, collections built patiently over decades, estates explicitly designed for very long-term purposes. The Brandywine Valley where Winterthur sits contains multiple DuPont estates: Nemours, Hagley, Longwood Gardens. Each represents a different branch of the family. Each was built substantially. Each has eventually become a museum or public resource. The DuPont approach to Gilded Age and post-Gilded Age wealth was notably different from families whose fortunes rose and fell more dramatically. Walking through Winterthur feels like experiencing accumulated knowledge more than accumulated wealth alone. The objects are valuable, but they're arranged to educate. The house is large, but the scale serves the collection rather than just ego. Everything suggests patience and very long-term thinking. This approach meant Winterthur was never really forgotten, because it never existed purely as a private palace. Henry Francis designed it to be shared, to preserve and present American decorative arts. The house served family needs, but those needs included creating lasting cultural legacy. Winterthur survived because it was built explicitly to survive. The collections were properly documented. The estate was financially structured for permanence. When Henry Francis died in the late 1960s, the institution continued without major disruption. The DuPont estates in Delaware represent perhaps the Gilded Age era's most successful transformation of private wealth into permanent cultural institutions. The families apparently understood that houses alone often can't survive across many generations. But houses built to serve clear public purposes, properly endowed and carefully structured, can potentially last indefinitely. Richmond's Gilded Age Compromise. Richmond, Virginia in the Gilded Age existed between different worlds. The city had been Confederate capital, still processing loss and destruction decades after the war. But it was also rebuilding, generating new wealth from tobacco and textiles, trying to establish itself as a modern industrial center while maintaining connections to older Southern traditions. Monument Avenue, developed in the 1890s, became Richmond's most significant Gilded Age residential development. The avenue was designed with monuments to Confederate leaders at major intersections. Grand homes were built along the boulevard by families making fortunes in tobacco, textiles, and railroads. The avenue represented Richmond's attempt to reconcile different impulses. The monuments honored the Confederate past. The mansions demonstrated new industrial wealth. The families building there were trying to create something that acknowledged Southern heritage while participating in national economic development. This created interesting architectural character. The houses were substantial, but generally not as large as comparable estates in northern cities. Richmond families had significant wealth, but often less than the largest northern industrial fortunes. The solution was emphasizing tradition, culture, and refinement rather than overwhelming scale. The mansions hosted gatherings that mixed business with careful social positioning. Tobacco buyers from the north, Virginia families with old names but sometimes declining fortunes, politicians navigating post-Reconstruction realities. Every gathering involved balancing economic necessity against social tradition. This balancing act defined much of Richmond's Gilded Age. The city needed northern investment for economic growth. But accepting that investment meant accommodating northern business practices and sometimes social attitudes. The families building on Monument Avenue were trying to modernize economically while preserving social structures that northern wealth sometimes questioned. The tension couldn't sustain indefinitely. By the early 20th century, Richmond's particular Gilded Age character was already shifting. Tobacco wealth consolidated into larger corporations. Some old Virginia families sold city properties. Monument Avenue's mansions began converting to apartments, institutions, and other uses. Many of the original Gilded Age mansions on Monument Avenue have been significantly modified or converted. The residential character has largely given way to institutional and commercial use. The avenue remains impressive architecturally, but its original social purpose has disappeared. Monument Avenue itself has become controversial in recent decades, as the Confederate monuments it was built around have become focal points for debates about historical memory and public symbolism. The mansions lining it are often architecturally intact, but serving completely different functions than their builders intended. Richmond's Gilded Age estates represent a version of wealth that struggled to fully commit to either tradition or modernity. The houses existed in uncomfortable middle ground, trying to honor Southern heritage while embracing industrial capitalism, attempting to maintain certain social structures while participating in national economies that increasingly rejected them. What Richmond's experience ultimately demonstrated was that strong regional identity couldn't survive national economic integration completely unchanged. The city's wealthiest families largely had to choose between maintaining Southern distinctiveness or fully participating in national economic development. Most chose integration, which meant their Gilded Age mansions gradually lost the specific cultural meaning they were built to project. The houses that remain are often beautiful, but serving purposes far removed from their origins. Monument Avenue stands as evidence of an attempt to build a Gilded Age on distinctly Southern terms, an experiment that produced impressive architecture, but ultimately couldn't sustain its original social vision. Biltmore and the transformation of Asheville. Biltmore needs little introduction. George Vanderbilt's estate in Asheville, North Carolina is America's largest private home, a French Renaissance chateau in Appalachian Mountains. Reportedly 250 rooms, massive scale, gardens designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, architecture by Richard Morris Hunt. Everyone knows Biltmore exists. What's less remembered is why George Vanderbilt built there, what Asheville was before he arrived, and how his presence transformed the region. Asheville in the 1880s was a small mountain town known primarily for health treatments. The altitude and climate were considered beneficial for respiratory ailments. People came seeking mountain air for health reasons, stayed in boarding houses and modest hotels. The town was utilitarian, built around the health trade rather than leisure or luxury. George Vanderbilt arrived in the late 1880s, visiting with his mother who was seeking mountain air. He was the youngest son of William Henry Vanderbilt, inheriting substantial wealth, but without the obvious roles his older brothers had claimed. They had the prominent New York mansions and Newport cottages. George needed to define his own purpose. He apparently found inspiration in the mountains around Asheville. The landscape reminded him of European estates he'd visited. Land was relatively inexpensive. The local population needed employment. He could build something unprecedented in America, a private estate on a scale the country hadn't seen. Construction of Biltmore took years, thousands of workers, materials shipped from around the world and across the country. Hunt designed a house that would have been impressive in Europe, stunning in American wilderness context. Olmsted created managed forests and designed landscapes across thousands of acres. The project transformed the local economy and put Asheville on a very different map. What George Vanderbilt built wasn't just a house, it was a complete estate, largely self-sufficient. Farms provided food, forests were scientifically managed, a village housed estate workers. The property operated almost as a private kingdom, with George as the decision-maker for this entire world. Asheville's relationship with Biltmore was complex from the beginning. The estate brought substantial employment and attention, but it also highlighted the enormous gap between Vanderbilt wealth and local economic realities. The house was extraordinary, but it was also a constant reminder of extreme inequality. Local people worked there but would never live there. They maintained a palace they would never enter as guests. George Vanderbilt was reportedly more conscientious than some Gilded Age heirs. He established forestry practices that influenced broader conservation thinking. He supported local institutions. He apparently tried to use his wealth with some sense of responsibility, but the fundamental relationship remained hierarchical. One man owned thousands of acres and an enormous house. Everyone else worked for him or benefited indirectly from his presence. Biltmore was never truly finished. George kept building and modifying until his death in 1914. His widow, Edith, opened the house and gardens to paying visitors in 1930, needing revenue to help maintain the estate during the Depression. That decision ultimately saved Biltmore, but fundamentally changed its nature. Today, Biltmore receives over 1 million visitors annually. It's among America's most visited historic houses. The property and surrounding operations generate substantial revenue. Vanderbilt descendants still own it, but as a major tourist attraction rather than a private residence. What makes Biltmore fascinating isn't only its scale, but its survival. The house was too large to easily demolish, too significant to abandon, too expensive to maintain purely as a private residence. Tourism provided a solution. The estate that represented Gilded Age private wealth became accessible to mass audiences, preserved through commercialization. Walking through Biltmore today is a carefully managed experience. The rooms are extraordinary. The collections are museum quality. But visitors move through prescribed paths, see curated presentations, understand the house through interpretation designed for large public audiences. The private palace has become public spectacle. Asheville itself was fundamentally transformed by Biltmore's presence and survival. The estate made the town a tourist destination. Visitors came to see Vanderbilt's palace and discovered the mountain setting. The city grew substantially around Biltmore's draw, building hotels and restaurants to serve tourism. The health sanatorium town became a resort city, largely because George Vanderbilt built there. But what existed before Biltmore is largely forgotten. The modest mountain town, the small farms Vanderbilt purchased to assemble his estate, the landscape before Olmsted reshaped it into designed wilderness. That world was largely erased when Biltmore was built, replaced by managed beauty and controlled experience. Biltmore represents both the Gilded Age's most complete realization in some ways and its most total transformation. George Vanderbilt built exactly what he wanted without significant compromise. The house survives largely intact, arguably in better condition than when he lived there. But it survives as museum and business operation, not as the intensely private world he created. The palace remains. The privacy is completely gone. Jekyll Island, America's most exclusive club. Off the Georgia coast sits an island that once represented perhaps the absolute peak of concentrated American wealth and power. Jekyll Island was purchased by a group of millionaires in the mid-1880s and became a winter retreat for families whose combined resources were staggering even by Gilded Age standards. The Jekyll Island Club wasn't open to anyone with money. Membership required invitation from existing members and approval from the club's governing structure. Social credentials mattered as much as fortune. The membership list eventually included Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, Morgans, Pulitzers, Goulds. It read like a directory of Gilded Age power. The island itself was entirely private, controlled completely by the club. Transportation came by boat from the mainland. The club maintained central facilities, but members could build individual cottages scattered across the island. These cottages ranged from comfortable to quite substantial, each representing a different family's approach to winter retreat. The Jekyll Island experience was carefully structured to allow choice. Members could be social or remain private as they preferred. The island offered hunting, fishing, riding, golf, and other activities. Social gatherings were organized, but attendance was optional. The entire environment was designed to let America's wealthiest families relax without the pressures of maintaining estates open to broader society's observation. This privacy extended beyond social matters. Jekyll Island became a place where the country's most powerful financiers and industrialists could meet informally, discuss issues affecting the national economy, have conversations without public scrutiny. The most famous example was a meeting in 1910 that reportedly helped lay groundwork for creating the Federal Reserve System. Significant financial planning apparently happened during Jekyll Island gatherings away from public attention. The island operated almost as an aristocratic preserve, an American version of exclusive European estates. The families who belonged apparently considered themselves natural leaders, people whose wealth and position gave them both capability and responsibility to influence national direction. Jekyll Island was where that group gathered, relaxed, and sometimes made decisions affecting many people who had no idea the island existed. The cottages built by members varied in scale. Some were relatively modest. Others, like the Rockefeller properties, were quite substantial. But even the larger ones maintained some air of informality compared to Fifth Avenue or Newport standards. These were retreats, places to escape the social demands of more public settings. Jekyll Island's exclusivity was absolute and apparently unapologetic. This wasn't about competition between wealthy families. It was about complete separation from everyone else. The club existed to create space where America's richest could live without encountering anyone outside their economic class. Even staff lived separately, maintaining the island without intruding on members' privacy. Such extreme isolation couldn't last forever. The Great Depression made concentrated wealth increasingly controversial politically. World War II made exclusive private retreats seem inappropriate during national crisis. By the mid-1940s, Jekyll Island's future as a private club was clearly ending. The members sold the island to the state of Georgia in 1947. The state converted Jekyll Island into a public park and historic site. The clubhouse and many cottages were preserved. The island became accessible to anyone, the complete opposite of what its founders had intended. Today, walking through Jekyll Island feels like touring the remains of concentrated power. The buildings stand, carefully maintained as historic structures. The landscape still shows its designed past. But the meaning has completely inverted. What represented ultimate exclusivity now demonstrates democratic access to history. The island that symbolized separation has become an educational resource about Gilded Age inequality. The cottages can be toured, the clubhouse operates as museum space and event venue. Visitors can stay in accommodations on an island where Rockefellers and Vanderbilts once gathered in complete privacy. The transformation is total. Jekyll Island as private kingdom is dead. Jekyll Island as public historic site thrives. What Jekyll Island represented at its peak was perhaps the Gilded Age's most successful creation of completely separate space for the wealthy. The families who built there achieved genuine privacy despite extraordinary fortune. They created an environment where they could live and conduct business without any public observation. But that very success contained problems. The absolute separation between Jekyll Island's members and the rest of the country became increasingly difficult to justify as wealth inequality sparked political reaction. The more exclusive the island remained, the more it symbolized what critics attacked about Gilded Age concentration of wealth. The island's transformation from private club to public park represents a kind of complete reversal. Not just loss of individual estates, but collapse of the entire social structure that made Jekyll Island possible. The assumption that extreme wealth deserved separate, superior space couldn't survive 20th century political and social changes. Jekyll Island today stands as monument to that shift. The buildings are evidence of what Gilded Age wealth could create when it wanted absolute privacy. Their current public use demonstrates that such exclusivity ultimately couldn't be maintained. The most successful retreat of America's wealthiest families became a state park accessible to anyone. It's perhaps the supreme irony in Gilded Age history. Whitehall and Flagler's Florida Vision. Florida's transformation from frontier state to winter playground was largely the work of one man. Henry Flagler, Standard Oil partner and close associate of Rockefeller, saw potential in Florida's climate and relative emptiness. He built railroads down the coast, constructed grand hotels at strategic intervals, and essentially created an entire winter resort industry from very little. Whitehall, Flagler's Palm Beach mansion completed in the early 1900s, represented his vision at full scale. Reportedly 73 rooms, designed by the architectural firm Carrere and Hastings. Marble, fine furniture, impressive scale that announced Flagler's status among America's wealthiest men. But Whitehall wasn't only a personal residence, it was also advertisement. Flagler built it partly to demonstrate what Florida could become, showing wealthy northeastern families that Palm Beach offered winter luxury that could rival anything in Europe or established American resort locations. The mansion proved that Florida wasn't just warm weather, it could be civilized and elegant, appropriate for people of substantial means and refined taste. The strategy apparently worked well. Wealthy families followed Flagler to Palm Beach. They built their own estates, generally smaller than Whitehall but substantial. The island became winter headquarters for elements of New York and Philadelphia society. The season ran roughly January through March, a concentrated period of social activity in tropical setting. Flagler's earlier work had laid necessary groundwork. In St. Augustine, he'd built the Ponce de Leon Hotel in the late 1880s, a large structure designed to convince people that Florida had culture and history worth experiencing. The hotel mixed Spanish Revival architectural elements with modern comforts, creating an aesthetic that suggested both tradition and contemporary luxury. The Ponce de Leon became a destination for wealthy tourists and people seeking warm weather for health reasons. It established St. Augustine as a winter resort before Flagler shifted focus further south to Palm Beach and Miami. The hotel demonstrated his approach: build impressive structures, provide quality service, market Florida as worthy of wealthy travelers' time and investment. Flagler kept extending his reach southward. His railroad eventually reached Miami, then continued into the Keys. Each extension opened new territory. Each new town became a potential resort location. Flagler didn't just build in Florida. He essentially created Florida as a concept in the popular imagination, transforming frontier territory into fashionable destination through infrastructure investment and sustained marketing. Whitehall embodied that transformation. The mansion was built on an island that had been largely uninhabited a relatively short time earlier. Flagler's presence essentially created Palm Beach as a resort town. The island existed as a fashionable destination because he decided it should. But Flagler's Florida empire had vulnerability. It depended on continued wealth inequality. Winter resorts required a class of people wealthy enough to maintain multiple residences and spend months in leisure travel. As that class became proportionally smaller in the 20th century, the original model became harder to sustain. Flagler died in 1913. His widow lived at Whitehall for several more years, then sold the property. The house became a hotel briefly, then stood vacant for periods. By the 1950s, Whitehall appeared headed potentially for demolition. The mansion that had demonstrated Florida's luxury potential seemed destined for destruction. Preservation came through family initiative. Flagler's granddaughter purchased Whitehall and arranged for it to become a museum. The house opened for public tours in 1960, transformed from private palace to historic site. Today, the Flagler Museum operates in Whitehall, presenting the story of Florida's development and Gilded Age winter society. Walking through Whitehall now, you see Flagler's vision preserved but fundamentally changed. The rooms remain largely intact, furnished to suggest their appearance during his lifetime. But the context is completely different. The mansion was built for private living and intimate entertaining among wealthy equals. Now, thousands of tourists visit annually, experiencing the house through organized tours and educational interpretation. St. Augustine's Ponce de Leon Hotel followed a different path. After many decades as a hotel, it became part of Flagler College in the late 1960s. Students now occupy spaces designed for wealthy winter tourists. The grand public areas see daily student traffic. Dormitories exist in former guest suites. The transformation is complete and somewhat ironic. What Flagler created in Florida was Gilded Age expansion at perhaps its most ambitious. He didn't just build individual estates, he built entire infrastructure for winter society, from railroads to hotels to his personal mansion. His vision fundamentally reshaped the state, creating a tourism economy that still dominates Florida's identity. But the private, exclusive component of that vision couldn't survive in its original form. Whitehall as a private residence lasted relatively briefly. The Ponce de Leon as an exclusive hotel lasted longer, but eventually became economically unsustainable in that role. The estates and hotels Flagler built to serve Gilded Age winter society all transformed into museums, educational institutions, or were demolished. Palm Beach itself survived but transformed significantly. The island remains quite wealthy, still functions as winter destination for people of means. But it's not Flagler's Palm Beach. The social structure he created, built on assumptions about permanent leisure class maintaining seasonal residences, that's largely gone. Modern Palm Beach operates on real estate value and contemporary wealth, not Gilded Age social rituals. Flagler's legacy is Florida as winter destination. That survives and thrives. But the specific world he built, private palaces and exclusive hotels serving a small group, disappeared within a generation or two of his death. His infrastructure and basic development proved more durable than the estates and exclusive social world they were designed to serve. Whitehall stands as monument to both Flagler's success and his vision's limits. The mansion proves Florida could host Gilded Age wealth at its grandest. But its transformation into a museum proves such grandeur couldn't remain purely private. The palace survives by becoming public. The vision survives only through abandoning its original exclusive purpose. From Massachusetts to Florida, the East Coast's forgotten Gilded Age palaces follow a consistent pattern. Enormous wealth, confident in its permanence, built estates designed to last for generations. Within decades, most had vanished or transformed beyond recognition. The mansions that survived generally did so by becoming something their builders never intended. Museums, colleges, parks, public historic sites. The The private palaces became accessible spaces. The exclusive retreats opened to broad audiences. Survival required abandoning the purposes they were built to serve. What the Gilded Age apparently couldn't anticipate was how quickly the social and economic structures supporting private palaces would shift. World wars made grand houses nearly impossible to staff and maintain. Economic depression made concentrated wealth politically controversial. Changing tax structures made dynastic fortunes harder to sustain across generations. The automobile democratized geography, destroying some exclusive retreats simply through accessibility. The families who built these estates seem to have assumed their wealth was permanent, their social position secure, their houses eternal. They were largely wrong. Within 2 or 3 generations, many fortunes had dissipated, been restructured, or been divided among numerous heirs. Social hierarchies collapsed or transformed fundamentally. Houses were demolished, donated, or converted to uses their builders would likely have found incomprehensible. What remains are fragments. A few preserved estates, maintained through enormous ongoing expense and institutional support. Photographs in archives showing houses that no longer exist. Property records documenting ownership that ended in demolition or transformation. The physical world the Gilded Age created has largely disappeared. But impact remains in unexpected forms. Estates that became parks, like Rockefeller's carriage roads or Jekyll Island's preserved landscape. Houses that became museums, teaching about wealth and its limitations. Infrastructure that outlasted private purpose, like Flagler's contributions to Florida development or Biltmore's managed forests. These transformed remnants now serve public purposes their creators likely never imagined. The forgotten Gilded Age palaces of the East Coast represent American wealth at both its peak and its failure to achieve permanence. The fortunes were real. The construction was substantial. The ambition was extraordinary. But almost none of it could survive the 20th century's transformation of American society and economic structures. Walking through what remains today, visiting museums that were once intensely private homes, hiking public trails that were once private carriage roads, you see evidence that the Gilded Age's assumptions about permanence were fundamentally wrong. The palaces couldn't adapt to new circumstances. The families often couldn't maintain them across generations. The economic and social mathematics changed too drastically and too quickly. What's perhaps most remarkable isn't that most of these estates disappeared. It's that anyone thought they wouldn't. The Gilded Age built as though its world would last indefinitely, apparently ignoring historical patterns showing that concentrated wealth and dynastic power eventually face disruption. The forgotten palaces aren't anomalies. They're predictable results of building private kingdoms in a democracy that was already changing. The East Coast landscape still bears marks of Gilded Age ambition, but mostly as absence. Empty lots where mansions once stood. Subdivided properties where single estates once dominated. Institutional buildings occupying spaces designed for single families. The geography remembers what standard history sometimes forgets. These weren't just houses. They were statements about wealth's power to create permanent monuments. Almost every one of those statements proved incorrect. The Gilded Age's most elaborate palaces are gone. The more modest ones often survive by becoming something completely different. The middle ground, estates too expensive to maintain privately, but not significant enough for institutional preservation, vanished most completely. Thank you for watching this exploration of the East Coast's forgotten Gilded Age palaces. If you've enjoyed this journey through lost architectural history, please subscribe for more stories about America's vanished estates and the families who built them.